On the morning of November 6, 2021, in the rolling hills of the Brecon Beacons in Wales, a seasoned caver set out on what was meant to be a routine expedition. The destination was Ogof Ffynnon Ddu, often shortened to OFD, a vast labyrinth of limestone passageways stretching more than 37 miles, 60 kilometers, underground. It was known as the longest cave system in the United Kingdom, and a place that attracted experienced explorers from across Europe. The man, described by friends as careful and highly skilled, had navigated these passages many times before. On that day, however, he entered not knowing that within hours, he would suffer a fall so severe it would trap him far from the surface. His position deep in the system meant that even a minor accident could become a life-threatening ordeal. By nightfall, word began to spread that a caver had been gravely injured underground. What followed was not only a fight for survival, but the beginning of what the British media would soon call the largest cave rescue in the nation's history. Ogof Ffynnon Ddu was unlike most caves that weekend adventurers might encounter. Hidden beneath the rugged slopes of the Brecon Beacons, its entrance led into a twisting underworld of passages, shafts, and underground rivers. The system ran more than 37 miles, 60 kilometers through fractured limestone, with chambers that dropped hundreds of feet, tens of meters, in sudden vertical pitches. For cavers, it was both a playground and a proving ground, a place where confidence could quickly turn to peril. Inside, the temperature held steady at around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, cool enough that stillness could chill the body over hours. The air was damp, walls slick with condensation, and the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. Beyond the entrance chambers, the routes narrowed into crawls barely 2 feet, 60 centimeters, high, forcing explorers to squeeze through with helmets scraping against the stone. In other places, sudden drops opened beneath their boots. A misstep could send someone plunging 20 feet, 6 meters, onto jagged rock. That November, the weather above ground had been unsettled. Rainfall earlier in the week meant water levels underground ran higher than usual. Streams carved their way through the passages, filling pools and coating ledges in a treacherous film. The veteran caver who entered on November 6 carried standard equipment, helmet, lamp, harness, ropes. Yet even with preparation, the cave demanded absolute attention. Subtle warnings were there. Rocks felt unusually slick. Small rivulets trickled into low passages where they were normally dry. At one point, a chill draft hinted at a deeper void ahead, where narrow ceilings sloped down into blackness. To an experienced eye, these might have signaled extra caution, but in the moment, with confidence built on years of successful descents, the signs blended into the background of an environment always harsh and unpredictable. The cave did what it always did. It concealed danger in plain sight. By the time the group pressed further into Ogof Ffynnon Ddu, the conditions were set. A single slip, one bad angle, could turn a calculated challenge into a crisis that no one was fully prepared to face. Deep inside Ogof Ffynnon Ddu, the terrain shifted from broad passageways to jagged slopes of fractured limestone. The caver, moving steadily with his team, reached a section that required careful footing across slick, uneven rock. In this area, drops opened below the path, some only 10 feet, 3 meters, others plunging more than 30 feet, 9 meters, into darkness. A misplaced step could mean disaster. It happened suddenly. As he maneuvered along a sloping ledge, his boots slipped on rock coated with moisture from the underground stream. In an instant, his weight shifted and his balance vanished. Witnesses later described hearing the thud of gear striking stone, followed by the echo of a body crashing downward. He had fallen nearly 50 feet, 15 meters, into a steep chamber. The landing was brutal. His helmet absorbed part of the impact, but his body struck the rock with crushing force. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He lay twisted on the cave floor, unable to move his legs. Reports later confirmed serious injuries, multiple fractures that made walking impossible. Every breath came shallow, echoing harshly in the cold chamber. Above, his companions scrambled to reach him, their headlamps flickering across the jagged shaft as shouts for help bounced through the cavern. Fear spread quickly among the group. Underground, voices carry in distorted ways, and the injured man's cries mixed with the sound of dripping water and distant currents. The cave seemed to magnify his suffering, turning each groan into a reminder of how isolated they were. One rescuer later recalled how the air itself felt thinner, every breath heavy with dread. Attempts to lift him failed immediately. The shaft was narrow, the angle too sharp for ropes to haul him directly back up. His injuries meant he could not brace himself or assist in any way. Each attempt to shift his body sent waves of agony through him, forcing the team to stop. They faced a terrible realization: they could not move him on their own. The cave's natural hazards compounded the crisis. The floor was littered with loose rock, and the chamber's ceiling pressed low, forcing rescuers to crouch in awkward positions. Their headlamps revealed mist rising from cold pools nearby, a constant reminder of how quickly hypothermia could set in. The temperature never climbed above 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, and his body, immobilized and injured, was losing warmth fast. Anxiety grew with every passing minute. The injured caver tried to remain conscious, whispering brief words through clenched teeth. His companions reassured him, promising help was on the way, but their eyes betrayed the weight of the situation. The surface lay hours away, through twisting passages, vertical climbs, and constricted crawls. Getting word to rescuers outside would be a challenge in itself. By the time the team decided to call for external rescue, the atmosphere underground had shifted entirely. What had begun as an exploratory trip now carried the weight of life or death. Far above them, night had fallen over the Welsh hills. In the darkness, phones lit up and calls went out. The news spread quickly. A man was gravely injured in Ogof Ffynnon Ddu, deep underground, and a rescue operation would have to begin at once. The cave had claimed its victim, but whether it would hold him there permanently remained uncertain. For those waiting in the chamber, the sense of isolation was crushing. For those on the surface preparing to descend, the challenge ahead would test the limits of human endurance and coordination. The first rescuers began arriving at the cave entrance within hours of the emergency call. By dawn, the scale of the operation was clear. This would not be a simple evacuation. The injured man was trapped nearly 3,280 feet, 1,000 meters, from the surface, deep inside one of the most complex cave systems in Britain. Every passage between him and daylight involved narrow squeezes, jagged climbs, and drops of 20 to 50 feet, 6 to 15 meters, that would challenge even uninjured cavers. Specialist teams from across the United Kingdom assembled, ultimately numbering more than 250 volunteers. They carried medical packs, stretchers, designed for confined spaces, and miles of rope and rigging equipment. Communication was limited. Radios struggled to penetrate the thick limestone, so runners were stationed throughout the cave, relaying messages from chamber to chamber. When rescuers reached the injured caver, they found him in pain but conscious. A doctor descended into the chamber, crawling through the same vertical shafts and low tunnels to stabilize him. Strong painkillers were administered, and his fractures were immobilized with splints. Then came the challenge of moving him. A specially modified stretcher, narrow and rigid, was brought down. It allowed rescuers to strap him securely, while handles on the sides gave teams leverage to lift and guide him through impossible angles. Progress was agonizingly slow. Every few dozen feet, or 10 meters, the terrain changed. In one section, rescuers had to lower the stretcher down a sloping chute slick with flowing water. In another, they rigged a pulley system to raise him up a vertical shaft nearly 40 feet or 12 meters high. Each maneuver required coordination of up to 10 people, working in silence except for short commands. The injured caver, sedated but still aware, groaned when jolts of movement sent pain shooting through his body. Above ground, the weather added another layer of difficulty. Cold November rain fell across the Brecon beacons, seeping into the limestone and dripping into the passages below. Rescue leaders worried that water levels might rise, making narrow crawls even more treacherous. As hours passed, the operation stretched into the night, then into another day. Fatigue began to weigh heavily on the volunteers. Some collapsed in exhaustion after hauling ropes and stretchers for hours, only to be replaced by fresh teams. Every small success brought a new obstacle. At one point, the stretcher had to be rotated vertically to fit through a 2-foot or 60-centimeter high crawlway. Rescuers pushed and pulled, scraping their helmets against the rock, guiding the injured man through by inches. In another chamber, they built a temporary dam to redirect water flow that threatened to flood the passage they needed to cross. Despite the setbacks, morale remained surprisingly strong. Volunteers described the atmosphere as determined, almost defiant. They were unwilling to let the cave claim a life. As one rescuer later recalled, "We moved him inch by inch, but every inch felt like a victory." By the end of the second night underground, the operation had become the largest cave rescue in British history. Teams rotated in shifts, medical staff monitored the injured caver constantly, and the stretcher edged closer to the surface. The final climbs loomed ahead, vertical shafts that would test the limits of human endurance. Above ground, floodlights illuminated the entrance, and the waiting crowd braced for either triumph or tragedy. By the time the third night descended over the Brecon beacons, the rescue had stretched close to 54 hours. Deep underground, the stretcher carrying the injured caver approached the final vertical shafts, the most difficult section of the entire route. Exhausted teams gathered their remaining strength. To fail here, within sight of the exit, would have meant every struggle before had been in vain. The first major obstacle was a shaft nearly 50 feet or 15 meters high, slick with water seeping from cracks above. Rescuers anchored ropes into the limestone, building a pulley system strong enough to lift the stretcher straight up. 10 men hauled in unison, their boots braced against the rock, while others guided the stretcher to prevent it from swinging into jagged walls. Each meter gained felt monumental. The injured man, heavily sedated, drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing steady but shallow. The cave seemed to hold its breath with him. When the stretcher reached the ledge at the top, cheers erupted, quickly silenced by the awareness that more challenges awaited. The passages narrowed again, forcing rescuers to tilt the stretcher at an angle. For nearly 200 feet, or 60 meters, they crawled sideways, shoulders scraping the rock, dragging the stretcher inch by inch. Sweat soaked through undersuits. Despite the chill, every rescuer carried bruises and cuts from the relentless limestone. Then came the final crawlway before the surface. Barely 2 feet, or 60 centimeters, high, it was infamous among local cavers for its claustrophobic squeeze. Moving a stretcher through seemed almost impossible. Yet the team refused to surrender. Piece by piece, they shifted equipment, rotated the stretcher, and forced their bodies into positions that defied comfort. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the scrape of helmets against rock and short commands echoing through the crawl. At last, a faint glow appeared, artificial light from the surface teams waiting at the entrance. The rescuers gave one final heave, pulling the stretcher into the chamber where cold night air drifted in. For the first time in more than 2 days, the injured man was within reach of daylight. As they emerged, floodlights illuminated the rescue site. Crowds of volunteers, medics, and anxious family members stood ready. When the stretcher was carried out of the cave mouth, applause and shouts of relief rang through the damp night air. The man had survived. Against overwhelming odds, he was alive, breathing, and finally free of the limestone maze that had held him captive for 54 hours. The moment marked not just the end of an ordeal, but a triumph of human determination. Britain's largest cave rescue had succeeded. The cave had tested every ounce of strength and skill from hundreds of people, and for once, the ending was not tragedy, but survival. When the stretcher finally emerged into the cold Welsh night, relief swept across the gathered crowd. The injured caver, though battered and broken, was alive. He was quickly transferred to a waiting ambulance, then airlifted to a hospital more than 60 miles, 96 kilometers away. Doctors later confirmed multiple fractures, but also described his survival as remarkable given the conditions underground. For the rescuers, exhaustion mixed with pride. Over 250 volunteers from across Britain had united, working in shifts around the clock. Their combined effort had pushed the limits of underground rescue, transforming a near-fatal accident into a story of survival. The British press called it the UK's biggest ever cave rescue, a title earned through sheer endurance and cooperation. In the aftermath, local authorities praised the volunteers, while the caving community reflected on the risks hidden beneath familiar landscapes. Ogof Ffynnon Ddu remained open, but with renewed warnings about preparation, weather conditions, and the unforgiving nature of limestone caverns. The lesson was clear: in caves, experience alone is never enough. Nature allows no shortcuts, and a single misstep can trigger an ordeal lasting days. One rescuer later remarked, if it had happened just 200 feet or 60 meters deeper, the outcome might have been very different.